Good morning, listeners. This is WhoRU. This is the WhoRU Promotes Ron Paul show. This is my first show here on We the People Radio Network. I was formerly a host on RBN for 5 or 6 months a couple of years ago, and my show there was a WhoRU show, which I talked about political status and things like that. Here I want to talk about Ron Paul and supporting Ron Paul and what we can do to get Ron Paul elected to President of the United States. But for those of you who don't know who I am, let me give you a little bit of history on me. I'm approximately 73 years old. I don't know exactly how old I am because I don't know for sure when I was born. Nobody knows when they were born. Nobody knows where they were born nor who their mother is. These are fundamental basics. Fundamental basics is one of the things I talk about the most. Everything that we do in our lives is based on fundamental basics. If we don't approach things from a fundamental basis, we wind up in the mess that we're in this country at this time. And when you get in this kind of a situation, you need someone like Ron Paul to bail you out. As I said, I'm about 73 years old. I've been in this patriot movement since about 1964. That makes it, about 43 years. I've been through all the patriot stuff. I've tried it all. Tried state citizenship, UCC-1 stuff, filing documents of rescission, Social Security number, driver license, and all those kinds of things. None of it really ever worked. In about 1964, I decided to don a new entity, and I became, at that time, Eric Williams. Since then, I've become Eric WhoRU. I have learned that we can be whoever we claim to be. I didn't like being who I was before, so I just dumped that identity and dumped everything that went with it. After that, I learned a lot about how it is to be a nobody or a non-person in this society. It's really amazing and quite enlightening. It's quite exhilarating in many different ways. In my escapades in California, I'm now in north central Arkansas, but at that time I was in Southern California, and I got involved in the tax rebellion in the late 60s and the early 70s, and I was designated by the IRS as the most dangerous tax protester in the southwestern part of the United States. And because of that, I wound up in tax court in Los Angeles. Tax court is a way where all of the people in the patriot community tells you you don't ever want to go because you can't win in tax court. The IRS owns tax court. Well, I never had filed a tax return or paid an income tax, so the IRS couldn't put anything together on me from any kind of records. I never had a bank account or a Social Security number or any of that stuff. But they followed me around and created what they imagined would have been my tax debt if I had been in their system. I went through the administrative remedy process, 2 or 3 different meetings. I don't remember exactly because it's been many, many years ago. Wound up in tax court, where all of my friends in the patriot community said, you don't ever want to go because you can't win in tax court. I didn't have a plan when I went in there, but I was out of there in 5 minutes, victorious, and I didn't even know that I had won. When I entered the courtroom, I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what I was going to do. I was totally under the guidance of my Creator, Universe Sovereign. When they called the case, the prosecutor stated, "Your Honor, citizens of the United States have an obligation to do all these things he started listing." I said, "Just a minute. I object." The judge said, "Why are you objecting? He hadn't said anything yet." And I said, "Well, he said citizens of the United States have an obligation to do all those things he was listing. I don't think he has anything in his file to prove that I'm in that class." The judge then asked me if I was renouncing my citizenship. And I said, "How can I renounce that which I never applied for?" He then asked me where I was born. And I responded, "The time that I was born, I'd just gone through a terrible ordeal. I was gasping for breath. I could neither read nor write. I didn't know who I was, where I was, nor even what I was." The judge then asked me what my mother had told me. I said, "Well, at the time that I was born, I did not understand the concept of mother-child relationship. I couldn't have picked my mother out of a lineup of one." The judge then asked me what was on my birth certificate. And I said, "Well, at the time that I was born, I did not understand the importance of such a document, and I didn't know that one was issued regarding my birth or not, and I denied that one was, and I said, 'He can't prove it,' gesturing toward the prosecutor. The judge then said that he would take it under advisement, and I would be notified. I sat back down. Everybody else started gathering up their things and packing up their briefcase to leave. After about 30 seconds, I realized we were done. I didn't understand why, but I packed up and went out the door, stood on the front steps wondering what happened. I went home and discussed it with my friends in the Patriot community, and they said, "Oh, well, they'll be contacting you in a few days and let you know." That was 37 years ago, and I'm still waiting. After that, I started my own furniture company and manufactured furniture in Southern California for about 22 years, shipping furniture all over the United States into half a dozen foreign countries, grossing $6 or $7 million a year. That's not profit, that's gross. Had 60 or 70 employees. I never filed a tax return or paid income tax. My company operated within the system, but I didn't. I never owned anything. It was all in a trust. I hired people to run the company and do all those kinds of things. I never had any problem with the IRS. Never have. Not to this day. During the course of that, about after I'd been in business about 6 or 7 years and was doing quite well, I was going out to get in my brand new Cadillac to go call on customers, and a white car pulled in. Two men sitting in the car flashed their badges on me and said that they were IRS special agents. They called me by name. I didn't recognize them, but they recognized me. Well, I had been in the tax rebellion. I had given hundreds of lectures to thousands of people, and my pictures, thousands of my pictures, were plastered all over Southern California, so they may have had a lot of pictures of me, but I didn't know who they were. They showed me a check, a cashier's check, and they asked me if I would identify my endorsements on the check. I did recognize the check, but I asked them, you're wanting me to help you prosecute someone regarding their income tax? And they said, well, yes, that's what they were there for. And I said, well, I'm surprised that you would ask me to help you do something like that. I don't see the check. I don't see any endorsement. I don't see you guys. Leave me alone. And I turned around and I got in my car, and they drove off and I drove off. And the point of that is they knew where to find me. They recognized me. They had to know what I was doing, and they left me alone. And they continued to leave me alone to this day. It took us a while to figure out what had happened that day. My friends didn't understand it. As the time went by, it became more obvious that the IRS wasn't going to come and get me. They didn't do anything to me. They put my friend and partner in the tax rebellion in prison for 2.5 years. He'd never given even one lecture, had never written any essays or any flyers, never had his picture presented all over Southern California. But they put him in prison for 2.5 years. He went to court with an attorney. I didn't. After he got out of prison, I was over at his house a few months later, and he showed me a newspaper article that he had received, one of those Patriot newspapers, which had set forth a conversation between a couple of Patriot leaders and a U.S. attorney in a casual conversation in a coffee shop in an airport somewhere. in which the article explained that as a result of this conversation, these two patriot types asked this U.S. attorney why it was in a prosecution of tax protesters, they always asked the defendant if he was a citizen of the United States. And the prosecutor, surprised at the naivety of their question, explained that, well, when a defendant comes in represented by an attorney, we don't go through all these little nitpicking points. But when a defendant comes in representing himself, then we have to be more careful and dot the I's and cross the T's. And so we have to establish that we have jurisdiction. If you're not a citizen of the United States, we don't have any jurisdiction over you. And my friend said, bingo, Eric, there it is. That's why they never bothered you. That judge in tax court couldn't get you to admit that you were a citizen of the United States. The strange and ironic thing about that is, if that judge would have asked me back in 1970 if I was a citizen of the United States, I would have said yes. At that time, I didn't have any idea that there was anything strange or unusual or undesirable about being a citizen of the United States. So we began studying this and trying to figure out exactly what it was. One thing led to another. I learned all kinds of things about what's going on in this country that I'd never ever considered before, about the Federal Reserve and the income tax and all of those things. And I learned all of the standard patriot myths about the Federal Reserve. Paper money, created out of thin air, worthless, fiat, unbacked. They create money whenever they want to. They put it in and out of circulation. They cause all kinds of problems intentionally. Some of those things are true, but a lot of them aren't. And none of them really address the Achilles heel of the Federal Reserve. And I didn't figure out what that was until some time later. But when I did, I started wondering what it was where everything started at. What was the fundamental basic of it? One day, I was over at a friend, about 10 o'clock at night, rambling on and on about the Federal Reserve and how corrupt it was. And he said, Eric, please take a look here out over the city at all these millions of blinking lights, as far as you can see, from coast to coast and border to border. As you can see across the whole country, there are millions and millions of these lights blinking 24 hours a day, and all of it caused by or enabled by Federal Reserve notes. Whatever it is, it can't be all bad. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. That really set me back and made me think. And I started doing my own homework, trying to figure out what it was about the Federal Reserve that might possibly be good. And I discovered some very, very strange things that were not commonly known in the patriot community. One thing about the Federal Reserve that nobody ever seemed to talk about, the real Achilles heel, the fact that no matter what kind of money system might be in effect, gold and silver or paper, it's always been the private lending of money that has been under private control. Paper or gold and silver, they always keep control of the lending of money. Doesn't make any difference where the money comes from or what you use for money or who creates it, as long as they have the private ownership. Then they can take their profit. That causes what we refer to in the Bible as usury. Usury requires the jubilee. Without usury, there would be no necessity for the jubilee. There's nothing in the Bible that prohibits the lending of money at interest. It's the continuous lending of money at interest over a long period of time that causes usury, the shrinking of the circulating money supply, so that the lender will become the owner of the borrower. And that's what usury is. When I figured that out, I realized that it wasn't paper money that was bad. And that isn't what caused our problem. It was the Congress spending the paper money into circulation in combination with what the Federal Reserve was doing. When I figured that out, I realized that there was a way that this system could be cured in 2007. I figured this out about 15 years ago, but we can cure this in 2007. It's how the interest on the money is distributed that is the key to this. Where does the interest go? Under the private ownership of the money system, the interest goes to the private owners of the Federal Reserve. And it goes into their private pockets and stagnates there unless they lend it back out, again at interest, and doesn't make any difference if it's gold and silver money or paper money. When they lend it out, they charge interest. When they charge interest, the borrowers have to pay back more than they borrowed. It's impossible for the lenders of money, particularly paper money, to collect back more than they lent out. I call this the single source doctrine. The single source of any item can never receive back more than the single source issues out. I'll be back after the break.
You'll find top.
Okay, before the break, I was talking about the money system and the usury problem in the Federal Reserve, and how what I was getting at is how we can do something about this. How we can stop I was talking about the single source doctrine. When the Federal Reserve issues money at interest, loans money at interest, it cannot make a profit called interest. It's impossible for the Federal Reserve to get back more than it lends out. The only way they can make a profit is by foreclosing. When borrowers pay the interest on their loans, the circulating money supply shrinks. When it shrinks down sufficiently, then the borrowers can't make their payments. They go into foreclosure. The banks then seize the pledged assets, like your home or your business, whatever it might be, and the bank then sells that at a profit. After that goes on for a while, when sufficient foreclosures have taken place and new borrowers have graduated from high school and college, then the economy will start picking up again. We go into a boom cycle, and this takes years to go back and forth. But the only time and the only way that the owners of the Federal Reserve can take a profit is by foreclosing, because they can't get back more than they lent out. Like General Motors is the only source of Chevrolet automobiles. Every single Chevrolet automobile on the planet Earth came from a General Motors factory. If General Motors was to do a general recall of all Chevrolets, not taking into consideration a lot of them have been destroyed, no matter that point, General Motors could never get back more than it had manufactured, not even one. The Federal Reserve manufactures all the Federal Reserve notes that are in circulation, and they all enter circulation as the principal of some borrower's loan. The Federal Reserve doesn't create any extra Federal Reserve notes for the borrowers to use to pay the interest on their loans. So the only source that the borrowers have is to use some other borrower's principal money. That causes the other borrowers to come up short. They go into foreclosure. Then the banks take their home or their business or whatever they had pledged as assets. The single source doctrine applies to the Federal Reserve the same way as it does to General Motors. There's no difference. So how do you stop this? How can you devise a money system that will allow the Federal Reserve to, or the money system, to not automatically become the owner of all the money, particularly of the interest that's paid on the loan. I finally figured out a way of doing that. And Ron Paul is talking about eliminating the Federal Reserve. This is a marvelous idea for Dr. Paul to put forward. And Dr. Paul can do this by using this system that I have devised, where we can not only eliminate the problems in the Federal Reserve, but also totally eliminate all taxation in the entire country and fund the government with interest collected on loans to private sector borrowers. When I finally figured this out about 15 years ago, I did some calculations, some quite extensive calculations, and I determined that the total interest take of the Federal Reserve and all of its member banks across the country was some 6 times more than the total of all taxes collected by every level of government in the country. Income tax, sales tax, property tax, cigarette tax, gasoline tax, you name it, I included it. The take for interest on loans was about 6 times more. So if we were to take all of the interest money and deposit it into the various levels of the treasuries of the various levels of government in the country and use that to fund our government, we would have more money than we need right now, including Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, aid to dependent children, or whatever else. There's plenty of money. We don't need to have any taxation at all. How do we call ourselves a free people, and how do we teach our children that they too are free when the very government that we created to protect our freedom funds itself by pointing its guns at us? Something is drastically wrong with this picture, and we must do something about it. We must get rid of armed robbery. Taxation is nothing but a euphemism for armed robbery. It's not that difficult to understand. It's really quite simple. Freedom and liberty is really quite simple. Everybody tries to make it complicated, but it's not all that bad. The Federal Reserve wants the money system to seem complicated so that we won't try to understand it, because they don't want us to understand this marvelous solution. All we need to do is have the federal government federalize the Federal Reserve, take all of this oversight and management and supervision away from Congress, and assign that responsibility to the 50 state legislatures so that the interest collected on the loans could be determined by the state legislature for each state, for each city, county, and the state, and also for the federal government. The federal Congress, under what I have devised, would not have any oversight authority whatsoever over the People's Central Bank. All of the interest that you are now paying on your house or your credit cards or your car mortgage or your car lease or rental, whatever it might be, all of that interest money would go into the People's Central Bank. You would keep on making all your payments just like you do right now. The economy in the country would not be in any way disrupted. But instead of the interest money being paid to the private owners of the bank, the Federal Reserve, the money would instead go into the various treasuries of the various levels of government. And then, instead of causing a recession, the money, by stagnating there, the money would be spent back into circulation by normal, everyday government expenses, and the interest money would then circulate back into the paychecks of the borrowers, who would then use the same interest money to make the payments on their next month's mortgage or credit cards or whatever it might be. We also hear it being said that when the Federal Reserve lends money, it really doesn't lend anything. Well, there's a certain amount of truth to that. The Federal Reserve isn't the source of the loan. The Federal Reserve does create the money to fund the loan, but that's not really the source of the value, because there is a loan of valuable wealth that does take place. The Federal Reserve is not the lender, however. And the Federal Reserve doesn't deserve in any way, shape, or form these huge interest profits that they are taking. The Federal Reserve employees and the president of the local bank branches all need to be paid a salary, probably equivalent to Walmart employees. But the real lender of the wealth that the borrower receives isn't the bank, it's the community. Take a house mortgage. A builder has built a brand new house. There's a family man, a young family man, a couple who have a couple of children who would like to have a new home. But they don't have $100,000 to pay for the house. We'll be back to finish this story after this break. Okay, listeners, before the break, I was talking about a $100,000 loan of a homeowner and a family man with a couple of kids who wanted to buy a house. They borrowed $100,000 from the bank. He didn't have the money. The builder has a house for sale, so the bank provides the money to enable the transaction to take place. But the bank is not the one that's making the loan. Where did the house come from? The house was built by the carpenters, electricians, plumbers, and masons, landscapers, gardeners, all the people who worked to create the house and make it beautiful and attractive to this new family, this new young family. It's all the people in the community who have contributed to that house. They haven't been paid yet. They don't get paid until the house is sold, because the gentleman who put the construction of the house together, who designed it, he doesn't have the money to pay anybody yet because he hasn't sold the house. So the new family man, the new family, they get a check for $100,000 from the bank, and the bank just created the money out of thin air, but not quite that true. That's not quite the whole story. What the bank did was monetize the future income of the borrower. The borrower has promised to create the value of the house, not only the $100,000 to buy the house, but also the borrower has agreed to create the value of the interest, another $200,000 on a 30-year loan. So the check is for $100,000. The borrower gets the check, hands it over to the builder. The builder gives him the key to the house. The builder then takes the $100,000 check, deposits it in his bank, and then writes checks to the carpenters, the builder, the electrician, the plumber, the gardener, the lumber supplier, the plumbing supplier, and everybody who contributed to building the house. They all accept this paper money, and they all circulate it among themselves as though it had value. Not because the bank said it had value, because the bank doesn't have any ability to imbue any value into this $100,000 or into the $200,000 interest. All of the value for that money doesn't yet exist, but it's coming into existence every day as the mortgage holder, the man who bought the house, as he works in the community, creating goods and services equal to the amount of his loan obligation. During the time that this is going on, 30 years, all the people in the community are agreeing to accept the $100,000 as though it already had the value that the home buyer is creating every day that he's working in the community. So who is it that actually made the loan? It's the community. In the event that something would happen to the borrower, and the borrower was not able to make all the payments. What if the borrower got hit by a Mack truck and got killed and didn't have any insurance? Usually there is insurance on the home and things like that, mortgage insurance, but in this example I'm going to say there wasn't any. In that case, the payments wouldn't be made. But the $100,000 that had been advanced by the bank was already in circulation. There isn't any way to get it out. That would be inflationary. But that's a fairly rare occurrence. The people in the community would have to eat it. They would just have to absorb it. They would keep on using that money because it was already out there. Then the bank would foreclose on the house because the borrower wasn't paying for it, and the bank would then become the owner of the house. How in the world can this be? The bank didn't have any investment in the house. The bank didn't loan its own money. The bank loaned the value that was supplied by the community, and yet when the foreclosure happens, the bank takes the ownership of the house and then sells the house to a new buyer. This time, though, the bank doesn't have to give any money to the builder because the builder and all those who participated in the building of the house, they've already been paid the first time around. So the second time around, the bank gets to keep all of the proceeds from the sale. The bank might even sell the house for more than $100,000 if it hadn't been very long that the owner had been in and the house had been improved some more. The bank might even get more. That would all be pure profit to the bank, and there would be no way that the bank would have been entitled to any of it because the bank never had any investment of its own in the original transaction. Under the solution that I have devised, when the buyer bought the house and started making the payment, it would still be the community that would be the source of the real wealth that had really provided the house to loan to the borrower. But when the payments were made, the interest wouldn't go to the private banker because the private banker would no longer be in the picture. The interest money now would go to the community, to all the people in the community to pay for the sidewalks and the streets and the schools and the police station and the fire station and whatever other expenses that the local government had in that community. There would be no need for taxation because there wouldn't just be one home buyer. There are, hundreds and thousands of home buyers in all of the communities across the land, millions of them. And if all that interest money was going into the treasuries of the county, city, county, and state and federal government, it could eliminate all taxation. It doesn't mean we eliminate any kind of government services. We would then have 6 times more money than we now have to pay for all of our government services. All the talk about Social Security Fund being bankrupt, we wouldn't need to have any more Social Security deductions from your paycheck because there would be plenty of money from revenue collected from interest on loans to private sector borrowers. All of those problems would go away. If the home buyer somehow, for some reason, was killed or whatever reason might be, didn't make the payment, we would have the same situation as we had before. The money would continue to circulate because it would still be out there. If the house was foreclosed on, then the house would become owned by the People's Central Bank, not by the private lenders. As the People's Central Bank is actually the people in the community under the guise of the local government, then the local community would be the owner of it, and then it would be sold, and the proceeds would go to the community again, just like interest on the loan. So this solution would allow for the total elimination of all taxation, euphemistically known as armed robbery. And it would eliminate the boom and bust cycle, to eliminate the profit-taking foreclosure cycles that we now enjoy under the private ownership of the Federal Reserve. This is a marvelous solution that I have been working on the development and refinement of for the past 15 years. I had no expectation that I would ever have an opportunity of presenting it to anyone until Aaron Russo came out with his marvelous DVD, America from Freedom to Fascism. When Aaron came out with that marvelous exposure of the IRS and the Federal Reserve, that this was my opportunity to really present this widely. That's what I'm doing here on this show. And what we need to do now is to get all of you listeners to understand this so that we can present it to Ron Paul, so that Ron Paul can use this as his campaign platform so that he will be able to keep his promise to eliminate not only the income tax, but all taxation in the entire Federation, and to fund the government with interest on loans. We'll be back after this break. Okay, listeners, we're back. I want to talk to you about my bumper music. If you didn't recognize that, that's Hail to the Chief, to the President of the United States, the future President of the United States, Dr. Ron Paul, Congressman from Texas. That's why I chose that bumper music, because we need to get used to hearing that in regards to Ron Paul, because they're going to be playing it a lot in the next 4 years after the forthcoming election for Dr. Ron Paul, the President of the United States. So I want to open the phones for calls, and our call-in number is toll-free 888-202-1984, or if you have unlimited long distance, please do call in on our line 512-646-1984. We greatly appreciate it if you would do that. So if you have anyone, if we have anyone listening who has any questions about anything that I've said about the solution that I have put forward and how it would work, please call in, and I'll be glad to answer any of your questions. So I want to continue, though, talking on that same note about what is it that is inflation and what is the cause. Because we hear a lot about how our money supply has, it being inflated only, it's only 2% this year. It's only about, 2 or 3%. That's not all that bad. Well, if you take 2% every year for 50 years, that's 100%. The Federal, in a lot of years, it's more than 2%. The price of gold today was, $747, I think it was. The highest that it's been for, 20 years? And it's not going down. It's going up and up and up. The value of the gold hasn't changed one bit. An ounce of gold is an ounce of gold. It's not one bit different. If you bought an 8-ounce can of beans 50 years ago for 10 cents, that would be one meal. If you bought an 8-ounce can of beans today for $2, it's still one meal. The value of the beans hasn't changed a bit. If you got to pay, 10 or 20 times more for it, what has changed is the value of the money. So when the price of gold goes up, the cause of that increase, or the price of beans goes up, the cause of that increase is inflation of the money supply. Now, classically, the word inflation was understood to mean the increase of the circulating supply of money caused when the government spent money into circulation that the government did not collect from the taxpayers. Just printed it up and spent it into circulation. That is not a good plan. That is inflation of the money supply. When the money supply is inflated by Congress spending money, that causes the prices to go up. But in recent years, the meaning and understanding of the word inflation has been changed to be used to mean the increase of the price of goods. The Congress is trying to put the blame, and the media is trying to put the blame on the retailers for raising the price. You can't raise the price. Retailers cannot successfully raise the price of commodities if there isn't money in the community that the purchasers can use to pay for the commodity. The only way that price can go up is when the government inflates the money supply. I have figured this out. We have two different money systems going on in this country at the same time. They both use the same kind of money. Federal Reserve notes. They're both the same size, the same color, the same denomination, and they intermingle. We can't tell the two apart. The money for one of the systems is the money that is created by the Federal Reserve for private sector borrowers, like my previous example of someone who wanted to buy a house and borrowed $100,000. That $100,000 has true value. It is not in any way worthless. It has the value of the house behind it. It has the promise of the borrower to create $300,000 worth of value, because the borrower is not only going to create the value of the $100,000, but he's going to create the value of the interest surcharge on that loan. That $100,000 that the Federal Reserve created for the first money system is truly valuable money. This is an understanding that has been greatly overlooked by the patriot community. On the other hand, the second money system, also funded by the Federal Reserve, is the money that is created by the Federal Reserve to give to Congress. And then Congress just spends it into circulation with no intent or possibility of ever paying it back. They pretend to pay some of it back in the money that they collect from the private sector taxpayers. But whenever they take any money away from the private sector taxpayers, that just makes it harder for the private sector taxpayers to make their payments, which causes them to go into foreclosure sooner. The money that is created by the Federal Reserve for the federal government is truly worthless, fiat, unbacked paper money. But the paper money that is created for the private sector is not worthless, it is not unbacked, and it is not properly called fiat money because it's not created by order of the government. It is created under authority of the government, but not on order of the government. It's created on order, if you will, of the borrower, of the private sector borrower. When the man went to the bank and signed the promise to repay the $100, he was ordering the money, like you place an order in a restaurant. And the bank delivered it to the borrower. When the government orders it, the money goes to the government. And when the government orders it, it's totally 100% worthless because the government has no ability to pay it back. So if the government ordered $100,000, if they would ever order such a small amount, and the government then spent that $100,000 in the same community where the borrower had borrowed $100,000 to buy his house, now there would be $200,000 in that community, and the money supply in that community would have been inflated by the government. $100,000 of worthless inflated money. That would cause all the prices in the community to go up by half. That's what inflation is, and the cause is the government, the Congress of the United States, spending money they did not collect from taxpayers. This is the problem that has to be stopped. We must take the creation of money away from the federal Congress. The federal Congress has proven time and time again that it cannot be trusted with the purse strings of this country. It has also proven that it cannot be trusted with the war-making power. The two are inseparable. they go together. Every time they start a war, they've got to have money. Where do they get the money? They just create it out of thin air. When have we had a legitimate war in this country? Not in my lifetime. World War II was concocted. World War I was concocted. The Korean Wars were concocted. This Iraqi fiasco is concocted, all for the purpose of making money. If the war-making power were taken away from Congress with a constitutional amendment, and the war-making power were placed in the hands of the 50 legislatures under my plan, it would require 75% of the state legislatures. With 50 states, that would be 37 states. They would all have to agree that we were in a state of war before money would be advanced to the federal government to fight the war. In the event that the state legislatures all agreed, 75% of them agreed, 37 states, that we were in a state of war, then those same state legislatures would authorize the Board of Governors of the People's Central Bank to advance a sum of money that those same state legislatures would decide to be deposited and credited to the federal treasury for the purpose of funding the war. That would not be a loan. That would be a credit, an advance for future interest that would be paid to the federal government after the war was over. After the war was over, as determined by the state legislatures, not by Congress, then the Board of Governors of the People's Central Bank, under the direction of the 50 state legislatures, would gradually withdraw any money, all of the money, that the state legislatures had authorized to be created and spent into circulation to fund the war. Please call in. After this break, I'm accepting calls, and the number is 888-202-1984 or 512-646-1984.